Rick Sanchez looks like the smartest person in the room. He solves anything. He answers to no one. Most people watching him figure that's just who he is. One therapist disagreed. She didn't see a genius. She saw a diagnosis waiting to happen. This is how a therapist would diagnose Rick Sanchez, the patient who refuses the chair. Rick Sanchez was supposed to be in a small office that afternoon, sitting on a couch, answering questions about his family. That was the plan. Beth had set it up. The two grandchildren, Morty and Summer, had been going through a rough patch that year, and a lot of it traced back to the divorce between Beth and Jerry. The kids had been acting out in ways that worried her enough to book a real appointment with a real family therapist, a woman named Dr. Wong. This was not a joke session or a background gag. It was a scheduled hour meant to deal with real damage in a real family. Rick did not want to go. Instead of saying no, or making an excuse, or simply skipping the appointment, the way most people avoid things they do not want to face, Rick built a machine in his garage that turned his entire body into a pickle. He did this on purpose, right before the appointment, specifically so that he would not have to sit in that office and talk about his feelings. Somebody who did not know him might think this was just another wild invention for its own sake, but the timing gives it away. This was not curiosity. This was an escape hatch, built and used in the space of a single afternoon with the explicit goal of avoiding one conversation. Think about what that means for a moment. A grown man, brilliant enough to build interdimensional travel devices, chose to turn his own body into a vegetable rather than sit through 50 minutes of talking. He did not need convincing that this was a strange decision. He knew it was strange. He wanted it to be strange because being a pickle was, in its own twisted way, the point. If he could not be reached as a person, he could not be asked to open up as one either. Turning into a pickle was not a side effect of the plan. It was the entire plan. The therapy appointment did happen. Beth, Summer, and Morty sat down with Dr. Wong on the scheduled day in the actual therapist's office. Rick was not there in human form. He had transformed himself right beforehand and now sat on the kitchen counter as an ordinary pickle, silent, watching the family leave without him. He had solved his problem, at least in his own mind. He had removed himself from the equation entirely by making himself into something incapable of speech, incapable of feeling, incapable of being questioned. A pickle cannot be pushed to talk about grief or fear or guilt. A pickle can only sit there. What Rick had not planned for was the family cat. While everyone else was out, the neighbor's cat wandered into the kitchen, spotted the pickle sitting on the counter, and knocked it off the edge. It rolled, bounced, and eventually slipped down into a drain that led into the sewer system beneath the house. In an instant, the entire plan collapsed. Rick was no longer a passive vegetable hiding out safely on a countertop. He was a small, helpless, immobile pickle stuck alone at the bottom of a filthy underground tunnel, with no way to reach anyone and no way to turn himself back. This is where the episode becomes strange in a completely different way, and it is worth walking through slowly, because every step of what happens next tells you something about the kind of mind Rick has, and the kind of choices he makes when he is cornered. A normal person, stuck as a pickle in a sewer, would have no options at all. Rick is not a normal person. Even trapped in a small, round, motionless body with no arms or legs, his mind kept working exactly the way it always does. He began looking for a way to survive. The sewer was full of rats and cockroaches, the ordinary kind of pests that live underground in the dark, eating whatever falls down there. For Rick, stuck without limbs, these creatures were both a danger and an opportunity. He could not move on his own, but he realized that the bodies of dead pests could be turned into moving parts, the same way a machine is made of gears and rods and wires. So he began killing them, one after another, and using their bones and shells to build a small mechanical body around his pickle form. Piece by piece, an exoskeleton took shape, giving his motionless body legs to walk on, arms to grab with, and enough mobility to fight his way toward the surface. This detail matters more than it might seem to on the surface. Most people, faced with an impossible situation, either give up or wait for rescue. Rick did neither. He looked at the only resources available to him, which were dead insects and rodents in a sewer, and built himself an entirely new body out of nothing. It shows a mind that refuses to be stuck, refuses to be small, refuses to simply wait things out. That refusal is admirable in one sense. In another sense, it is exactly the same trait that got him into this mess in in the first place. Because the entire disaster started with him refusing to sit still for one conversation. Once his makeshift body was strong enough to move and fight, Rick began working his way out of the sewer system. Along the way, he ran into more rats, bigger ones, and he had to fight through several of them using the mechanical limbs he had assembled. He was calm about it the entire time, almost bored, treating the sewer rats the way someone might treat an inconvenient chore rather than a life or death situation. This calm is worth noticing. Most people in mortal danger show fear. Rick showed something closer to mild annoyance, as if the universe had simply given him one more small problem to solve before he could get on with his day. Eventually, he made his way out of the sewer system entirely, only to find himself in a completely unexpected place, an underground facility connected to what appeared to be a foreign government office, filled with armed guards and secret agents. The building had nothing to do with his family or his home. It seemed to belong to some kind of intelligence or security operation, staffed with agents in suits who quickly noticed the strange pickle creature crawling through their walls and hallways. What might have been a quiet escape back to daylight instead turned into a full-blown fight against trained security personnel who saw him as a serious threat. During this stretch of the story, Rick encountered a mercenary named Jaguar, a hardened fighter being held prisoner by the same agency running the facility. The two of them ended up working together, at least for a while, joining forces to survive the guards and traps set up throughout the building. Jaguar had his own reasons for wanting out, tied to a family he had left behind in another country, and for a short stretch of the episode, the two of them fought side by side against a common enemy. It is a strange alliance, considering how the whole situation started, a pickle and a professional killer fighting through a secret government building together, but the show plays it with total seriousness, never winking at how absurd the setup is. The fighting escalated from there. Guns, explosions, and increasingly dangerous traps filled the building as Rick and Jaguar pushed their way toward an exit. At one point, Rick found himself facing down a bomb threat, timed explosives, and the threat of an airstrike, all while still technically being a pickle wearing a suit made of rat and cockroach parts. He handled each obstacle with the same detached confidence he showed underground, treating world-class danger the same way most people treat a broken printer. Eventually, after a long stretch of destruction, fire, and violence, Rick managed to escape the building and make his way back out into the world, badly damaged but alive. By the time this entire underground odyssey finally ended, hours had passed. What began as a plan to sit out one family therapy session had turned into a full survival ordeal involving sewage, insect anatomy, foreign mercenaries, government agents, gunfire, and explosions. And Rick still needed one thing to finish the whole ordeal: the chemical formula required to turn himself back into a human being. That formula happened to be sitting in Dr. Wong's office, the same office where the family therapy session had been taking place the entire time. So, still covered in sewage and rat blood, still wearing the mechanical body he had built from dead pests, Rick walked into the therapy office to get it. This is the moment the entire episode has been building toward, and it deserves to be looked at closely, because it is where the real diagnosis begins. Rick arrives at the therapy office not because he decided therapy might help him after all. He arrives because it is the only place with the chemical he needs. Even at this point, after everything he has been through, his goal has nothing to do with self-reflection. He wants the formula. He wants his human body back. He still has no interest in the actual conversation that was supposed to happen in that room hours earlier. Dr. Wong, to her credit, does not react with shock or panic at the sight of a rat mech pickle walking into her office covered in blood and grime. She stays calm, almost unimpressed, and begins talking to him the way she would talk to any patient, regardless of what body he happens to be wearing that day. This calm is important. It tells you that she is not interested in the spectacle of what Rick has done. She is interested in why he did it. The bizarre journey through the sewer and the government building does not impress her the way it seems to impress Rick himself. She sees straight past the mechanical body and the survival story to the much simpler fact sitting underneath it. A man went to enormous, dangerous, self-destructive lengths to avoid one conversation about his family. What follows is a long exchange between the two of them, and rather than repeating the exact words, it is worth walking through what each of them was actually saying. meaning, because the meaning underneath their conversation is where the real information lives. Dr. Wong begins by asking Rick why he did not want to come to the appointment in the first place. His answer, stripped down to its core idea, is that he does not believe in therapy at all. He describes himself as a person who fixes problems directly, through action and invention, rather than through conversation. In his mind, sitting in an office and talking about feelings is something other people need, people who cannot solve their own problems the way he can. He compares the comfort that therapy gives people to the kind of calm you might give an animal being raised for food, something meant to keep a creature relaxed and unaware rather than genuinely capable. He insists that this kind of peace is not something he wants for himself, because he does not see himself as that kind of creature. He sees himself as something wilder, something that does not need to be soothed or managed the way ordinary people do. This answer tells you almost everything you need to know about how Rick sees himself, and it is worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past it. He is not saying therapy does not work. He is saying it is beneath him. He is placing himself outside the category of people who need this kind of help, as though needing to talk about pain is a weakness reserved for less capable minds. This belief lets him avoid the entire process without ever having to argue that the process itself is wrong. He does not need to prove therapy is useless. He only needs to convince himself that he, personally, does not belong in the group of people who require it. Dr. Wong does not argue with him directly about whether therapy works. Instead, she makes a much sharper observation, one that cuts past his entire explanation. She tells him that the real connection between his intelligence and the damage happening inside his family is that everyone in that family, himself included, uses being smart as a shield to avoid dealing with what is actually wrong. She is not attacking his intelligence. She is pointing out what he is using it for. According to her, Rick swings back and forth between treating his own mind as something unstoppable and treating it as a curse he cannot escape. And the one idea he refuses to consider is the simplest one, that his mind is something he actually controls, rather than something controlling him. She continues by pointing out something almost impossible for Rick to argue with, because it comes from his own actions, rather than from any theory about his personality. She reminds him that he chose to come to her office. He chose to talk, even if only to insult her profession. He chose, hours earlier, to turn himself into a pickle in the first place. None of this happened to him. He caused every part of it. And yet here he sits, covered in the aftermath of an entire day of violence and destruction, having survived sewer rats, government agents, and explosions, purely so he would not have to sit quietly in a chair and answer a few honest questions about his family. Then she makes one final point that lands the hardest of anything she says. She tells him that she has no doubt he would find regular therapy boring, the same way she finds it boring to brush her teeth or clean up after herself. According to her, real change does not come from adventure. It comes from repair, from maintenance, from the unglamorous daily work of keeping something functional. Rick, she suggests, chases adventure specifically because adventure lets him avoid that kind of slow, unglamorous repair. Turning into a pickle, fighting through a sewer, taking down an entire security operation. All of it gave him something exciting to survive. None of it gave him anything to actually fix. Rick does not have a real response to this. He does not argue back with one of his usual clever remarks. He simply sits there, in silence, still wearing the shell of dead insects he built to survive the day. For a character who almost always has something sharp to say, this silence says more than any comeback could. He has been seen clearly, maybe more clearly than he has been seen in a long time, and for once, he has nothing to throw back at the person doing the seeing. Later in that same conversation, Beth, his daughter, says something about him that reveals just as much about the family as anything Dr. Wong says directly. She describes her father as someone who does not need anything from anyone, and she says it with real admiration in her voice, as though this is one of his best qualities. Dr. Wong responds by pointing out, gently, that Beth admires him for this. It is a small moment, easy to miss, but it shows how deeply this idea about Rick has spread through the rest of the family. His daughter has grown up believing that never needing anyone is a strength worth aspiring to, rather than a wall built to keep people out. Whatever pattern created Rick clearly did did not stop with him. It passed itself down. Step back from the entire episode for a moment and look at the shape of it as a whole. A man was asked to sit through 1 hour of conversation about his family. Instead, he chose to become a vegetable, fell into a sewer by accident, built a mechanical body out of dead rats and cockroaches, fought his way through an underground tunnel system, stumbled into a secret government facility, teamed up with a mercenary, survived gunfights and explosions, and eventually made his way, hours later and covered in blood, back to the exact room he had been trying to avoid in the first place. All of that effort, all of that danger, all of that destruction existed purely to dodge a single conversation that most people would sit through without much trouble at all. This is not a small detail buried somewhere in the episode. This is the entire point of it. The writers built an absurd, action-packed, almost unbelievable adventure specifically so that it could be measured against something as ordinary as a scheduled therapy appointment. And the contrast is meant to feel ridiculous. It is meant to make you laugh at how far someone will go to avoid something small and uncomfortable. But underneath the laughter sits a genuinely sad idea. A person who will do all of that, who will risk his life and kill dozens of small creatures and destroy an entire building, rather than simply sit down and talk, is a person who is terrified of something in that conversation. Not the room, not the questions, whatever sits underneath the questions. This is why the refusal itself matters so much, before anything else about Rick can be understood. Before you can talk about his drinking, his family history, his sense of humor, or anything else about who he is, you have to start with the fact that he will go to almost any length to avoid being looked at closely. That single fact shapes everything that comes after it. It explains why so much of what he does looks like distraction. It explains why his adventures so often escalate into chaos, right when things start to feel personal. It explains why the smartest person in every room he enters somehow always finds a way to avoid the one conversation that might actually help him. None of this required guessing at what was going on inside his head. The show handed the audience two people saying it plainly, in the same room, on the same day. A daughter praising her father for needing nobody, and a therapist calmly pointing out that needing nobody is not strength, it is armor. Rick sat between the two of them, freshly emerged from an entire day of violence he brought on himself, and said nothing in response to either one. There is one more thing worth noticing before moving forward, something almost easy to miss because it happens so quietly. The tool Rick used to survive his entire ordeal, the thing that got him out of the sewer, past the rats, through the government facility, and back to that office in one piece, was his intelligence. The same mind that built the pickle machine also built the mechanical rat body. The same mind that avoided the conversation also solved every single problem standing between him and avoiding it further. His intelligence did not stay out of this story. It ran the whole thing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That detail becomes the next piece of the picture, because it raises a question this episode does not fully answer on its own. If intelligence is the tool Rick reaches for every time something threatens to touch him emotionally, then intelligence itself stops looking like a gift and starts looking like something closer to a wall, built brick by brick out of every clever invention he has ever made. Whether that wall was built on purpose or simply grew that way over time is the very next thing worth looking at closely. Section 2. Intelligence as a diagnostic symptom, not a trait. By the time Dr. Wong finally gets Rick alone in her office at the end of that long, exhausting day, something strange has already happened to the entire tone of the story. For most of the episode, the show has been showing off just how clever Rick is. He turned himself into a pickle using pure invention. He survived a sewer using nothing but dead bugs and rats and his own quick thinking. He fought through armed guards, disarmed traps, and outsmarted an entire government facility, all while stuck in the body of a vegetable. Anyone watching up to that point would walk away thinking the same thing that most people already believe about Rick, that his mind is the most powerful weapon in the entire show, sharper than any gun, more dangerous than any bomb, capable of solving absolutely anything. Then, Dr. Wong sits across from him and calmly takes that entire idea apart. She does not do it by saying Rick is not smart. Nobody could argue that. And she does not try to. Instead, she does something something much more precise. She tells him that his intelligence and the damage happening inside his family are connected. And the connection is this: everyone in that family, Rick included, uses being smart as a way to avoid dealing with what is actually wrong underneath. She is not saying his mind is broken. She is saying his mind has a job to do that has nothing to do with solving problems. And that job is to keep him from looking at himself too closely. This is worth slowing down on, because it is easy to hear a line like that and nod along without really understanding what it means. Think about how Rick uses his intelligence throughout the episode that is just played out. Every single use of his brain, from the pickle machine to the mechanical rat body to the escape from the government building, was aimed outward. He solved external problems. He got out of tight spaces. He avoided threats to his body. Not one single use of his intelligence that day was aimed at himself. Not once did he sit still and ask why he needed to escape a simple conversation so badly that he was willing to become a vegetable to do it. His mind worked constantly and brilliantly the entire episode, and none of that brilliance ever pointed inward. That is exactly what Dr. Wong is describing. A person can be endlessly clever about everything except the one subject that actually matters to their own well-being. Rick can build a working exoskeleton out of dead pests in under an hour, but he cannot sit in a chair for 50 minutes and answer questions about his family. Both of those things come from the same brain. The difference is not ability. The difference is what the brain has been trained to avoid. Dr. Wong goes further than just pointing out that his intelligence gets used this way. She describes a very specific back and forth that seems to happen inside Rick's mind over and over. She says he swings between two extreme views of his own thinking. Sometimes he treats his mind like an unstoppable force, something so powerful that ordinary rules do not apply to him, and ordinary people cannot understand him. Other times, she says, he treats that same mind like a curse, something painful and inescapable that traps him rather than helps him. What he never seems to consider, according to her, is a much simpler and much less dramatic idea, that his mind is simply his, something that belongs to him and is within his control, neither a superpower nor a punishment, just a tool he is choosing how to use. This detail matters because both of the extreme views Rick holds, whether he sees his mind as a gift or as a curse, let him avoid the same uncomfortable middle ground. If his mind is an unstoppable force, then he is special, different from everyone else, someone who cannot be expected to sit through the same small emotional struggles that ordinary people go through. If his mind is a curse, then he is a victim of his own brain, someone who cannot help how he acts because the thing running his head is simply too much for him to manage. Either way, the responsibility gets moved somewhere else. Either way, Rick gets to avoid the idea that he is actually choosing every single day how to use what he has. There is something almost mathematical about how neatly this fits the events of the episode. Rick could have simply told his family he did not want to go to therapy. That would have been an ordinary, if frustrating, choice. Instead, he built a machine and turned himself into a vegetable, an act so extreme that it can only be explained by one of two stories. Either he is so far beyond ordinary rules that normal responses do not apply to him, or he is so trapped by whatever is happening in his own head that turning into a pickle actually felt like the easier option. Both of those stories make him seem larger than life. Neither of them requires him to simply admit that he was scared of a conversation. Dr. Wong does not stop at describing the pattern. She backs it up with something much harder for Rick to argue against, because it does not rely on her opinion of his personality. It relies on his own actions from that exact day. She reminds him, plainly, that he chose to come into her office. Nobody forced him. He chose to talk, even if what he chose to say was mostly insults directed at her profession. And before any of that, hours earlier, he chose to become a pickle in the first place. Every single step of the chain that led him, filthy and battered, into her office that evening was a choice he made himself. Nothing about it happened to him. He built it, piece by piece, exactly the way he built the machine that started it all. This point cuts through a lot of the noise that surrounds Rick as a character. Throughout the show, he is often treated, both by people around him and by fans of the show itself, as someone swept along by forces bigger than himself. himself. A genius too big for ordinary life. Someone whose chaos is simply the natural result of being smarter than everyone else. Dr. Wong refuses to accept that framing. She keeps bringing the conversation back to choice. He chose the pickle. He chose to fight through a sewer rather than wait for help. He chose insults over honesty when given the chance to speak. None of this is presented as something Rick could not help. It is presented as a pattern of decisions, made again and again, that all lead in the same direction, away from the one thing he is supposed to be doing that day, and towards something loud, dangerous, and impressive instead. Then comes the part of her speech that seems to affect Rick the most, based on how he responds to it, or rather, based on how he does not respond to it at all. Dr. Wong tells him that she has no doubt he would find regular, ongoing therapy incredibly boring. She compares it to something almost embarrassingly small and unglamorous, brushing your teeth or cleaning up after yourself. She says these are chores nobody finds exciting, but they matter anyway, because the real work of taking care of something, whether it is your body or your mind or your family, is not an adventure, it is maintenance. It is the same small task, repeated quietly, day after day, without any explosions or escapes or clever inventions involved. This single comparison lands so hard because of everything that has already happened in the episode. Rick has just spent an entire day proving, in the most extreme way imaginable, that he will choose adventure over almost anything else. Given the option between a boring conversation and a life-threatening escape through a sewer full of rats, followed by a shootout in a secret government building, he chose the second option. Not because he had to, because some part of him would rather survive genuine danger than sit through genuine honesty. Dr. Wong is naming that exact trade the moment she brings up brushing your teeth. She is saying, in the plainest terms possible, that Rick has built his entire life around chasing the kind of problems that can be solved with cleverness and explosions. Because those problems, no matter how dangerous, are still easier for him than the quiet, boring, repetitive work of actually taking care of himself and the people around him. It helps to notice what Rick does not say in response to any of this. Throughout the rest of the episode, and throughout most of the show in general, Rick almost always has something to say. He interrupts people, he mocks them, he turns serious moments into jokes with a quick, cutting remark. That is part of what makes him fun to watch. But in this scene, after Dr. Wong lays out everything above, he has nothing. No comeback, no joke, no clever twist that turns her observation back on her. He simply sits there, still covered in the dirt and blood from his day underground, and lets what she said sit in the room without answering it. Silence, for a character who almost never runs out of things to say, is its own kind of evidence. If Dr. Wong had been wrong about him, or even partly wrong, Rick would likely have said so. He does not hold back opinions, even uncomfortable ones, in almost any other situation in the show. His silence here suggests that whatever she said reached somewhere real, somewhere he did not have a ready answer prepared for, because normally he does not need one. This is one of the only moments across the entire episode where the smartest person in the room has nothing clever to add. There is another piece of this conversation worth pulling out separately, because it does not come from Dr. Wong at all. It comes from Beth, Rick's daughter, sitting in the same room. At one point, describing her father, she says that he does not need anything from anyone, and she says it like a compliment, like something to be admired. Dr. Wong responds simply by pointing out that Beth admires him for exactly that. It is a short exchange, easy to miss in the middle of a much louder conversation, but it says something important about how far this pattern has spread. Beth did not invent the idea that never needing anyone is a strength. She grew up watching her father live that way. She absorbed it the same way children absorb almost everything about how the adults around them handle pain. Not through lessons or lectures, but simply by watching what gets treated as normal in the house they grew up in. If Rick spent years modeling total self-sufficiency as the ideal way to handle hard feelings, it makes sense that his daughter would grow up believing the exact same thing, admiring the exact same trait in him that a therapist, hearing it from the outside for the first time, immediately recognizes as a warning sign rather than a strength. This detail connects directly back to the larger point Dr. Wong made earlier about intelligence being used to justify sickness. It is not just Rick's mind doing this work. It is the whole family's understanding of what strength looks like. like. Beth has learned to see emotional independence, the refusal to ever need help from another person, as something worth admiring rather than something worth questioning. She is applying the same defense her father uses, just wearing it slightly differently. Where Rick hides behind invention and adventure, Beth hides behind quiet loyalty and admiration, defending a pattern that is actively making things harder for her own children without recognizing it as a pattern at all. Step back again and look at the full shape of what this single scene accomplishes. An episode that spent most of its runtime showing off how impressive and capable Rick's mind is, ends with a therapist calmly explaining that this same mind has been repurposed, probably a long time ago, into a tool for avoidance rather than a tool for solving things. The pickle machine, the mechanical rat body, the fight through the government facility, all of it gets reframed in the space of a few quiet minutes. What looked like proof of genius now looks like proof of exactly how far someone will go to avoid a conversation that most people would find only mildly uncomfortable. This reframing does not erase how impressive Rick's actions were. He really did survive an underground ordeal using nothing but wit and dead insects. That part of the story is not undone by anything Dr. Wong says. What changes is the meaning attached to it. Impressive and healthy are not the same thing. A person can do something incredible and still be using that incredible ability to run away from something small. In fact, the show seems to be arguing that the more incredible the escape, the more likely it is hiding something the person desperately does not want looked at directly. There is a reason the writers chose to end this particular episode on a quiet conversation instead of another action sequence. After an hour of explosions, mutated rats, government agents, and a full mechanical battle suit built out of vermin, the final scene takes place in a small office, with two people sitting across from each other, talking. No music swells, no new invention appears to save the day. The contrast between the noise of everything that came before and the stillness of this last conversation is deliberate. It tells the audience, without needing to say so directly, that this quiet moment matters more than everything loud that led up to it. The chaos was the distraction. The conversation was the point. Rick walked away from that office still holding on to his belief that therapy was beneath him. He did not suddenly change. He did not apologize or admit that Dr. Wong was right. But the show does not need him to change in that moment for the audience to understand what just happened. The scene does not exist to fix Rick. It exists to reveal him clearly, in a way that nothing else in the episode manages to do. For one quiet stretch of time, the audience gets to see past the invention and the danger and the jokes, straight down to the much simpler truth sitting underneath all of it. A brilliant mind working very hard at the wrong job. This raises a natural next question, one the show does not leave unanswered for long. If Rick's intelligence is being used this way, as armor rather than as a tool for genuine problem solving, then something else has to be filling in the gap left behind. A person cannot run entirely on cleverness and distraction forever without something else creeping in to cover the exhaustion underneath. For Rick, that something else shows up constantly throughout the series, sitting right next to the invention and the escapes, rarely commented on directly, but always present in the background of almost everything he does. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That something is drinking, and it shows up so often across the show that the writers themselves have described Rick in their own words using that exact label before ever introducing a single plot point. Whatever role his intelligence plays in keeping people at a distance, his relationship with alcohol plays an equally important role in explaining what happens when that distance starts to slip. Section 3. The Alcoholic Scientist. Function, not flavor. Before Rick and Morty had aired a single episode, before audiences had any idea what kind of show they were about to watch, there was already a short description used to explain the basic idea of the series. That description called Rick an alcoholic scientist who drags his grandson along on dangerous adventures across space and time. This was not a detail added later by fans trying to explain his behavior. It was written into the very first explanation of who Rick is, right alongside being a scientist and being reckless. His drinking sits at the center of his character from the very beginning, given equal weight to his intelligence. That detail is easy to skip past, because the show rarely stops to make a big deal out of Rick having a drink. He is shown drinking constantly in almost every episode, often without anyone commenting on it at all. A flask appears in his hand during quiet moments. He takes a sip before making a big decision. He shows up late to important events because he was drinking beforehand. None of this gets treated as unusual within the world of the show. It is simply part of the background, the same way some characters are shown eating a meal or driving a car. But the fact that it never gets highlighted is exactly what makes it worth paying close attention to. A habit this constant, shown this casually, across this many episodes, is not filler. It is a pattern the show trusts the audience to notice on their own. One episode makes this pattern impossible to ignore, because it stops being background noise and becomes the entire plot. That episode is often called the Vindicators episode, and it follows Rick and Morty as they team up with a group of space heroes to stop a dangerous villain. On the surface, this sounds like a fairly normal action story, the kind of plot you might expect from any adventure show. What actually happens over the course of the episode turns that expectation upside down, and drinking is the reason why. The episode begins with Rick and Morty being called to join a team of superheroes known as the Vindicators, a group Rick has worked with before and does not think highly of. Morty is excited to be included since he sees these heroes as impressive figures worth looking up to. Rick, on the other hand, treats the whole team with open contempt, mocking their dramatic backstories and their self-important attitude towards saving the universe. As the team gathers to plan their mission, one member arrives late and immediately blames it on being at a party. A few moments later, Rick admits he was also late and gives the exact same reason: drinking. Nobody in the room reacts to this the way you might expect. No one raises an eyebrow. It gets treated as a normal, forgettable detail, tossed off and forgotten within seconds. That casualness is worth sitting with. In the real world, someone showing up late to an important, dangerous mission because they had been drinking would raise real concern. In Rick's world, it barely gets a reaction. It is simply what everyone expects from him. As the mission unfolds, the team fights their way through a series of dangerous traps and enemies, eventually defeating the main villain they were sent to stop. This part of the episode plays out like a fairly standard team-up story, full of jokes about superhero cliches and over-the-top action. Then, once the main threat is dealt with, something strange happens. The team suddenly finds themselves trapped inside a separate set of deadly puzzles, clearly built by someone with detailed knowledge of the building and a personal grudge against every member of the group. It quickly becomes clear that Rick is behind it, but not the Rick standing in front of them at that moment. This version of Rick has no memory of building any of it. The explanation given is that a version of Rick from the night before, while extremely drunk, snuck away from the group and quietly built an entire deadly obstacle course throughout the building, tailored specifically to punish or kill each member of the Vindicators. This past version of himself, referred to throughout the episode as Drunk Rick, is treated almost like a separate person, someone whose decisions the sober Rick, standing there now, cannot fully account for or explain. He does not deny that he did it. He simply cannot remember doing it, and has to piece together the reasoning behind each trap the same way everyone else does, by solving the puzzles and figuring out what his own drunken mind must have been thinking. This detail deserves close attention, because it is not played as a joke about forgetfulness the way a hangover gag might be in an ordinary comedy. It is played with real weight. An entire team of people is now in mortal danger, forced to solve a series of deadly riddles because of choices made by a version of Rick that even Rick himself does not remember being. The consequences of his drinking did not stay contained to the night he was drunk. They followed him into the next day, threatening the lives of everyone around him without his even being aware of what he had set in motion. As the team makes their way through trap after trap, small details begin to reveal what drunk Rick was actually thinking while building all of this. Each puzzle seems to punish the Vindicators specifically for the things Rick resents about them: their overblown backstories, their self-importance, their need for constant praise and adoration. One especially telling detail comes when Morty realizes that solving one of the traps requires figuring out something deeply personal that only someone paying very close attention to Rick would know, related to complaints Rick makes while drunk about international politics and military spending. Morty is able to solve it precisely because he has spent enough time around drunk Rick to know exactly what kind of things he rants about when he has had too much to drink. This tells you that Drunk Rick is not some completely random, unpredictable version of the character. He follows patterns. He has specific, repeated grievances that show up reliably whenever alcohol lowers his guard. Sober Rick may hide behind jokes and cleverness, but Drunk Rick apparently cannot help revealing what is actually bothering him. The traps eventually lead to the emotional center of the entire episode, a final challenge where Drunk Rick asks for something he claims is the one part of the Vindicators worth anything to him. The team assumes this must be a piece of technology or a weapon, since that is the kind of thing Rick usually cares about. Instead, it becomes clear that what he actually wants placed on the platform is Morty. Morty steps forward and the platform lowers into what looks like it might become an emotional tribute, hinting that somewhere underneath all the destruction, Drunk Rick built this entire deadly night specifically as an elaborate way of expressing how much his grandson means to him. Then the show pulls the reveal in a completely different direction. The tribute was never for Morty at all. It was built for Noob Noob, a minor, overlooked member of the group who had laughed at one of Rick's jokes earlier in the episode. Rick, so starved for a small moment of approval, had spent an entire drunken night building a massive, elaborate reward specifically for the one person who had simply laughed along with him, while completely forgetting to include Morty in any of it, despite Morty being his own grandson and the person he supposedly cares about most. This twist matters enormously to understanding what alcohol appears to unlock in Rick. Sober, in front of other people, Rick maintains tight control over how much affection or need he ever shows. He mocks people who want approval. He treats emotional connection as something beneath him. Drunk, alone, with nobody watching to judge him, he spends an entire night building an elaborate monument to gratitude for one small laugh from a background character nobody else even bothers to remember. The version of Rick that comes out when his guard is down through alcohol is not more dangerous or more cruel than Sober Rick. In some ways, he is more honest. He wants to be appreciated. He wants someone to laugh at his jokes and mean it. He simply cannot let that want show while sober, because Sober Rick has to protect the image of someone who needs nothing from anyone. The tragedy of the episode becomes clear in its final minutes. After everything that happened, after the traps, after the deaths of several team members caught in Drunk Rick's obstacle course, after the entire emotional weight placed on that one tribute meant for Noob Noob, Sober Rick does not even remember who Noob Noob is. When the name comes up again near the end, Rick draws a complete blank, unable to place the character his drunk self had built an entire elaborate gift for just hours earlier. Whatever meaning that small moment of laughter held for Drunk Rick, it disappeared the moment the alcohol wore off, taking every trace of that gratitude with it. This detail turns what could have been a simple joke about forgetfulness into something much sadder. Rick's drinking does not just loosen him up or make him careless for a night. It creates an entirely separate version of himself, one capable of genuine, undefended emotion, and then erases all memory of that emotion the moment he sobers up. Whatever kindness or need or gratitude slips out while he is drunk gets locked away again as soon as the effects fade, leaving Sober Rick with no memory of ever having felt it and no reason to believe he ever will again. It is worth pausing here to notice how many people were harmed because of a single night of drinking that Rick himself cannot recall. Several members of the Vindicators died working their way through the traps he built. An entire team was placed in mortal danger. All of it stemmed from choices made during a blackout. Choices Rick was not even aware he had made until forced to solve his own puzzles after the fact. This is not a story about someone having a bit too much fun at a party. This is a story about someone whose drinking creates real, lasting, sometimes fatal consequences for the people around him. Consequences he does not even remember causing. There is another moment earlier in the episode worth connecting to this pattern. A moment that seems small at first, but grows heavier the more the rest of the story unfolds. During an argument, Morty accuses Rick of being jealous of the Vindicators, and Rick eventually admits, almost reluctantly, that Morty is right. This admission comes from Sober Rick, in a moment where his guard slips just slightly, not from alcohol, but from being cornered by his own grandson's honesty. It reveals that everything Rick has done throughout the episode, the mockery, the traps, the elaborate sabotage, comes from a much simpler, more human place than pure cruelty or boredom. He is jealous. He wants to matter to Morty the way these superheroes seem to matter to him. He wants to be seen the way they are seen. And rather than simply saying any of that out loud while sober, his drunk self built an entire deadly night trying to prove it indirectly, through elaborate puzzles and a tribute meant for someone else entirely. Put all of these pieces together and a clear shape starts to form. Rick drinks constantly throughout the show, treated as such an ordinary part of his personality that nobody around him reacts to it anymore. In this one episode, that drinking stops being background detail and becomes the direct cause of real, serious harm. Harm that Rick himself has no memory of causing. Underneath the destruction, the drinking reveals something surprisingly tender, a need for approval and connection that sober Rick refuses to admit he has. And once the alcohol wears off, all of that tenderness disappears completely, leaving behind a man who cannot even remember the name of the person his drunk self spent an entire night trying to thank. This pattern lines up closely with something Dr. Wong pointed out in the earlier therapy scene. The idea that Rick swings between seeing his own mind as an unstoppable force and seeing it as something separate from his control. Drunk Rick fits that second description almost perfectly. Sober Rick refers to him as if he were an entirely different person, someone whose choices he has to investigate rather than simply remember. This is not just a joke about being forgetful after a night of drinking. It reflects a much deeper habit of separating himself from the parts of his own behavior he does not want to take responsibility for. If drunk Rick did it, then sober Rick gets to treat those actions as something that happened to him rather than something he chose. This connects back naturally to the pattern already established in the first two sections. Rick's intelligence gets used to avoid dealing with his family directly, turning a simple therapy appointment into an entire day of danger and distraction. His drinking works in a strikingly similar way, except instead of avoiding a conversation, it avoids an entire emotional need, the simple desire to be liked and appreciated by the people around him. Sober, he cannot admit that need exists. Drunk, the need takes over completely, driving him to build something as extreme and elaborate as an entire deadly night of puzzles, just to feel, even briefly, like someone cares about him the way he secretly wants them to. None of this makes Rick a simple villain, and the episode does not seem interested in painting him that way either. If anything, the ending leaves you feeling sorry for him. He built something that could have been a beautiful, if strange, tribute to the one relationship that matters most to him, his connection with Morty. Instead, it went to someone he cannot even remember, wasted the moment it left his hands, invisible even to himself the instant he sobered up. The saddest part of the whole episode is not the danger or the deaths. It is the fact that the one honest, generous thing Rick did in that entire story disappeared from his own memory before anyone could ever recognize it as generosity in the first place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This raises an obvious next question, one the show does not let sit unanswered for long. If drinking unlocks a version of Rick capable of genuine need and even generosity, and if sober Rick spends so much energy denying that any of that exists inside him, then the admission Morty forces out of him, the plain acknowledgement that he is jealous of the Vindicators, deserves a much closer look. That single word carries more weight than it seems to at first, because jealousy requires wanting something specific from someone else, and wanting things from other people is exactly what Rick has spent the entire episode, and arguably the entire series, trying to convince everyone he does not do. Section 4. The jealousy underneath the nihilism. There is a single word that gets used against Rick partway through the Vindicators episode, spoken by his own grandson, and it changes the entire meaning of everything that has happened up to that point in the story. That word is jealous. Morty says it plainly, almost in disbelief, after watching his grandfather spend the whole episode tearing apart a group of superheroes with insult after insult. And instead of laughing it off or turning it into another joke, Rick admits it. He does not deny it. He does not twist the conversation around the way he usually does when something gets too close to true. He simply agrees, yes, he is jealous. To understand why that one small admission explanation matters so much. It helps to look back at everything Rick says and does throughout the episode leading up to that point, because almost none of it makes sense as simple boredom or simple arrogance once you know where it is actually coming from. From the very beginning of the episode, Rick treats the Vindicators with open, constant contempt. When Morty first gets excited about being called to help the team, describing them as first line of defense against evil, guardians of the unguarded, Rick shoots the whole idea down immediately, calling them the writers of their own press releases. He is not simply saying they are not very good at their job. He is saying their entire identity is made up, a performance built for attention rather than anything real. This kind of comment could be read as Rick simply being Rick, cutting everyone down because that is what he does to everybody. Except the show does not treat his contempt toward the Vindicators the same way it treats his contempt toward other things. It keeps circling back to them specifically, again and again, in a way that starts to feel less like general cynicism and more like something aimed very precisely at this one group in particular. The clearest sign of this comes when Rick and Morty learn that the Vindicators had already gone on a mission without them, one where several team members were killed. Rick's first reaction is not concern for the fallen heroes. It is a sarcastic comment about how things felt less diverse without him and Morty there, immediately followed by a much sharper piece of information. The reason he and Morty were left out was described as a personality conflict. Morty, putting the pieces together, says he thinks the personality conflict in question might have actually been Rick himself. Rick's response is not denial. It is something closer to offended disbelief, expressed through mockery, as he points out that the team wanted him gone so badly that they were willing to lose 3 teammates rather than deal with him, and still ended up needing him back anyway. Notice what is actually happening underneath the joke in that exchange. Rick is upset about being excluded. He frames it as an insult to his usefulness, mocking the idea that the team could not survive without him. But the emotional core of the comment is about being pushed out of a group. Somebody who genuinely did not care about the Vindicators at all would have no reason to be bothered by being left off the invite list for their previous mission. The fact that it comes up at all, and the fact that Rick brings a defensive, mocking energy to the subject rather than simple indifference, tells you that being excluded actually stung, even if he would never phrase it that plainly out loud. As the episode continues, Rick keeps finding new ways to tear down the individual members of the team, and the specific target of his mockery is worth paying attention to. He does not simply insult their fighting skills or their intelligence. He goes straight for their backstories, the personal tragedies that supposedly explain why each of them became a hero in the first place. One teammate lost his parents in a railroad accident and gained the power to summon ghost trains. Rick's response is not sympathy. It is a joke about how at least the dead parents were spared from having to watch their grown son wear a whistle. Another hero shows up late because he was out drinking and gets a laugh from the group for it, prompting Rick to point out that he was also late because of his own drinking, though nobody finds that funny when he says it. This pattern of mockery repeats throughout the episode, and it eventually gets summed up almost perfectly during one of the deadly puzzle challenges later on, when Morty has to solve a riddle based entirely on how Rick privately views each hero. The answer that solves the puzzle is the word unoriginal, describing how Rick sees the backstories of the entire team. Every single one of these heroes, in Rick's private assessment, is built out of the exact same tired formula. Tragedy leads to power, power leads to a costume leads to a dramatic name. He does not see anything special or unique about any of them. He sees a template repeated over and over with slight variations, and he clearly resents having to treat that template with any kind of respect. This is where the contempt starts to look less like simple arrogance and more like something with a specific target. If Rick genuinely believed nothing mattered, if his nihilism were as complete and total as he often presents it to be, there would be no reason for him to care whether these heroes' backstories were original or not. A person who truly believes nothing has meaning does not bother sorting other people's pain into categories of impressive or unoriginal. Sorting requires caring about the category in the first place. The fact that Rick has clearly spent an enough time thinking about each of these heroes to rank their tragedies against each other suggests he is far more invested in this group and in how he measures up against them than his stated worldview would ever admit. The turning point of the episode arrives during the final deadly challenge, the one built by drunk Rick the night before. As covered in the previous section, sober Rick has no memory of building this particular test and has to work through it the same way everyone else does, guessing at what his drunk self must have been thinking. The final room asks for something the Vindicators have that Rick values, warning that everyone dies if the wrong answer is placed on the platform. After a moment of confusion, Morty steps onto the platform himself, apparently guessing that he is the answer drunk Rick was looking for. While the platform lowers Morty down into what looks like it could become an emotional tribute, Rick's mask slips completely for the first time in the entire episode. He tells Morty, without any of his usual sarcasm, that he appreciates him, and admits that Morty must have found it difficult to accept that Rick had been right about the Vindicators all along, since Morty had clearly wanted to believe in them. Morty agrees that it was hard and asks why. Rick's answer is the moment the entire episode has been building toward. He explains, plainly, that being right does not earn you people's approval when they already do not like you, and that everyone wants the people they already like to be right, which is why popular people can get away with being far less thoughtful than they actually are. This single explanation reframes everything Rick has done throughout the episode. He is not simply mocking the Vindicators because he thinks they are silly or because tearing people down amuses him. He is mocking them because he resents a world where likability decides whose opinions get taken seriously. And he knows, on some level, that he is not likable in the way these heroes are. He can be right about everything, he can see through their performance perfectly, and none of that will earn him the easy trust and admiration that these heroes get simply by being charming. That resentment has been sitting underneath every insult in the episode, and this is the first moment it gets said out loud, directly, without a joke attached to soften it. The moment Rick finishes explaining this, the bomb threatening to destroy the platform powers down, disarmed. Morty immediately understands what just happened, saying it plainly. Rick is jealous. And Rick, for once, does not argue. This admission deserves to be sat with carefully, because it does something almost nowhere else in the show does quite so directly. Rick spends most of his time presenting himself as someone above ordinary human wants, someone whose intelligence and power place him outside the petty concerns of approval and belonging that drive everyone else. Jealousy requires the opposite of that. Jealousy requires wanting something someone else has, wanting it badly enough that watching them have it hurts. A person who has genuinely moved past caring what others think does not feel jealous of people who are simply better liked. Rick's jealousy proves, in his own words, that he still cares deeply about being liked, about being trusted, about belonging to something the way these heroes belong to each other, even while spending the entire episode pretending that none of it matters to him at all. This connects directly to something the show has hinted at from its earliest episodes, and that critics reviewing this exact episode have pointed out as well. The gap between Rick's stated philosophy that nothing in the universe truly matters, and the way he actually behaves when something touches him personally. A person who genuinely believed nothing mattered would have no reason to feel jealous of anyone for anything, since jealousy only makes sense if the thing being envied actually has value. Every time Rick shows jealousy, resentment, or hurt over being excluded, he is quietly proving his own stated philosophy wrong, whether he means to or not. The episode does not stop at this one admission. It builds toward an even sadder discovery once the platform Morty is standing on finally reaches the bottom. The tribute everyone assumed was meant for Morty turns out to have been built for someone else entirely. Noob, a minor, largely ignored member of the Vindicators who had simply laughed at one of Rick's jokes earlier in the story. While blackout drunk the night before, Rick had apparently been so moved by that one small moment of genuine, uncomplicated laughter that he spent the entire night building an elaborate, heartfelt reward for the person who gave it to him, all while forgetting to build anything similar for his own grandson standing right in front of him. This detail deepens the picture of jealousy already established rather than replacing it. Rick is not simply jealous of the Vindicators as heroes, he is starving for the specific, uncomplicated complicated experience of being appreciated without having to earn it through being impressive or being right. Noob laughed at his joke without needing convincing, without needing Rick to prove anything first. That small, easy moment of approval apparently meant more to drunk Rick than anything else that happened during the entire mission. More even than his own relationship with Morty, at least for one drunken night. Once sober, Rick cannot even remember who Noob is, which means the one honest gesture of gratitude he made in the entire episode gets erased from his own memory before he ever gets the chance to understand what it revealed about him. Put together, the full picture of this episode looks like this. Rick spends the entire story attacking a group of people for being unoriginal and performative, using mockery as a way to keep himself from ever having to admit that some part of him wants exactly what they have: acceptance, admiration, and a place inside a group that trusts and values them without conditions. When directly confronted by Morty, he admits the jealousy outright, in a rare moment of complete honesty. And in the one moment his guard was fully down, during a night of drinking he cannot remember, that same jealousy did not come out as more mockery. It came out as generosity, aimed at the one person who had given him a small, free moment of approval, with no memory of that generosity surviving into the next morning. This matters enormously for understanding the wider pattern building across every section so far. In the first section, Rick's intelligence was shown protecting him from having to sit through an uncomfortable family conversation. In the second section, that same intelligence was revealed by Dr. Wong to function as a shield rather than a tool, something used to avoid rather than to solve. In the third section, alcohol was shown unlocking a version of Rick capable of real need and even tenderness, followed by total memory loss the moment sobriety returned. Now, in this section, the actual content hiding behind all of that armor becomes clear for the first time in the character's own words. Jealousy, plain and specific, aimed at people who receive the kind of easy acceptance Rick has never learned how to ask for directly. None of this requires assuming anything about Rick that the show does not already state outright. Morty says the word. Rick agrees with it. The bomb disarms the moment the truth gets spoken. The show is not hinting at jealousy through subtle visual clues or ambiguous behavior that could be read multiple ways. It hands the audience the exact word, spoken plainly, confirmed without argument, in the middle of a life or death situation where lying would have made no difference to the outcome. There was no reason for Rick to admit it unless it was true, and the show chose to have him admit it anyway. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That belief did not appear out of nowhere. Beth learned to see her father's isolation as strength by watching it up close every day for years. The next part of this story goes looking for where that pattern actually started. Section 5. He doesn't need anything from anyone. Hyper-independence as defense. During that same conversation in Dr. Wong's office, the one already covered in earlier sections, there's a short exchange between Beth and Dr. Wong that is easy to miss the first time through, buried in the middle of a much louder scene involving pickles, rat blood, and sewer battles. But this small exchange might be the most important moment in the entire episode for understanding not just Rick, but the whole family that grew up around him. At one point, while talking about her father, Beth says that he does not need anything from anyone. She says it with real pride in her voice, the way someone describes a quality they admire deeply in a parent. She follows it up by saying that needing nothing from anyone is better than making your problems other people's problems. In her mind, this is not a warning sign. It is a strength, maybe even the greatest strength her father has. Dr. Wong's response is short and simple. She tells Beth that she admires him for that. That single sentence from Dr. Wong is not a compliment. It is an observation, delivered calmly, without judgment, but pointing directly at something worth examining. She is not agreeing that needing nothing from anyone is a healthy way to live. She is naming the fact that Beth believes it is, and holding that belief up so everyone in the room, including the audience, can look at it clearly. The therapist does not need to argue against the idea directly. She simply repeats it back in a way that makes its strangeness obvious. Think about what Beth is actually describing here, and what it means for a father to raise a child who ends up admiring total emotional independence this deeply. Beth did not arrive at this belief on her own, out of nowhere, as an adult. She grew up watching her father live exactly this way, day after day, for her entire childhood. Whatever version of Rick raised her did not teach her through words that needing help is weak. He taught her that lesson through example, the same way most people learn how to handle difficult feelings. Not by being told directly, but by watching what the adults around them do when things get hard. If Rick spent years never asking for help, never admitting when something hurt him, never leaning on another person during a difficult moment, then Beth grew up believing that behavior was simply what strength looked like. She did not have another model to compare it against. Whatever Rick actually felt underneath that independence, whatever fear or loneliness might have been sitting behind it, Beth never got to see that part. She only got to see the finished performance. A man who handled everything himself, who never seemed to need comfort, who solved every problem through invention and cleverness rather than through connection with another person. This detail becomes even more important once you consider the state of the family at the exact moment this conversation takes place. Beth and her husband Jerry are in the middle of serious marriage problems that eventually lead to divorce. Her two children, Morty and Summer, are old enough to notice everything happening around them, and the tension in the house has clearly been affecting both of them in ways serious enough to require a real family therapy appointment. This is not a family in a stable, happy place. This is a family under real strain, with a marriage falling apart and two kids caught in the middle of it, sitting in front of a therapist because things have gotten bad enough to require outside help. And in the middle of that exact crisis, the version of strength being held up as admirable is a man who needs absolutely nothing from anyone. Think about how strange that is, given the situation. A family that is falling apart, one that badly needs its members to lean on each other, to ask for support, to be honest about what hurts, is looking up to the one family member who has built his entire identity around never doing any of that. The model of strength available to this family is exactly the opposite of what a family in crisis actually needs from each other. Dr. Wong does not spend a long time unpacking this point out loud. She lets the moment speak for itself, the same way she often does throughout the episode, offering a short, precise observation and then letting the family sit with it, rather than lecturing them about what it means. But the placement of this small exchange, right there among the bigger, louder moments involving Rick's own confrontation, is not an accident. It shows that whatever is happening inside Rick did not stay contained to him. It became the emotional blueprint the rest of the family uses to understand what a strong, capable adult is supposed to look like. There is another detail from this same scene worth including here, because it shows just how far this pattern of avoidance has already spread through the next generation before anyone in the family even seems to notice. Earlier in the appointment, before Beth's comment about her father, Dr. Wong picks up a small book sitting on her coffee table and mentions that Summer has been reading it during their sessions. The book turns out to be filled with pictures of people eating waste, and when Morty reacts with disgust, Beth explains, almost casually, that Summer reads this kind of material because it lets her avoid saying out loud that she is angry with her mother. According to Beth, doing something strange and distracting like that is Summer's way of not having to say the words, "I am angry at you," directly to the person she is angry with. Notice how closely this description of Summer's behavior matches the larger pattern already running through the rest of the family. Summer, like her grandfather, has found a strange, indirect outlet that lets her avoid a direct, honest conversation about how she actually feels. Instead of telling her mother she is angry, she does something odd and disconnected from the actual issue entirely. It is a smaller, quieter version of what Rick does on a much larger scale, turning himself into a pickle rather than simply saying he does not want to talk about something. The specific method looks different from generation to generation, but the underlying shape of the behavior, finding some strange substitute activity rather than facing an uncomfortable feeling directly, repeats itself almost exactly. This is not something the show states outright, the way it does with Rick's jealousy in the following episode, covered in the previous section. Nobody in this scene says directly that Summer learned this pattern from her grandfather, or that the family as a whole has built its entire way of relating to each other around avoidance rather than honesty. But the pattern is laid out clearly enough through small, connected details placed one after another in the same short scene that it becomes hard to miss once you notice it. A father who avoids his own family by turning into a pickle. A daughter who admires that avoidance as strength. A granddaughter who avoids her own anger by reading strange books instead of speaking directly to her mother. 3 generations, 3 different specific behaviors, one shared underlying shape. It is worth pointing out here that Dr. Wong never gets to finish her actual assessment of this family dynamic out loud, because Beth interrupts her partway through with a sharp, angry response. Earlier in the same conversation, before the exchange about needing nothing from anyone, Dr. Wong begins describing what she believes is happening inside the family, saying she suspects Rick and his relationship with his own family created a very specific dynamic, one that does not reward emotion or vulnerability, and may actually punish it. She suggests that this dynamic likely damaged Beth's marriage, and may be teaching her children to misdirect their own feelings rather than express them honestly. Before she can finish exploring this idea any further, Beth cuts her off with a sharp response, clearly upset by how close the observation is hitting. This reaction matters just as much as anything said afterward. If Dr. Wong's observation were completely off base, if the family truly did not run on the pattern she is describing, there would be little reason for Beth to respond with that much anger. People tend to react strongly to ideas that feel uncomfortably accurate, not to ideas that feel completely wrong. Beth's sharp response suggests that some part of her recognizes the truth in what Dr. Wong is describing, even while another part of her is actively working to shut the conversation down before it goes any further. This detail connects directly back to the earlier moment where Beth praises her father for needing nothing from anyone. Both reactions, the defensive anger at Dr. Wong's observation and the open admiration for Rick's self-sufficiency, come from the same underlying place. Beth is protecting a story about her family that feels safer than the alternative. If her father's independence is a strength worth admiring, then the family does not have a problem worth examining closely. If the dynamic Dr. Wong is describing is accurate, then years of avoided feelings and misdirected emotions run through every part of the household, including her own marriage and her own children. It is easier in the moment to defend the first story than to sit with the second one. None of this makes Beth a villain in her own story, any more than it makes Rick one. She is doing exactly what her own upbringing taught her to do, the same way her children are already learning to do the same thing from her. She is protecting the version of her father that lets her feel proud of him, rather than the version that might require her to grieve something she never quite got from him growing up. Admiring his independence is, in its own way, easier than admitting that his independence may have come at a real cost to the people who needed him to lean on them once in a while. There is a wider pattern worth naming here, one that ties together everything covered across the first 4 sections of this story. In the first section, Rick avoided a direct conversation with an elaborate, dangerous escape built entirely out of invention. In the second, his intelligence was shown functioning as a shield rather than a tool, according to Dr. Wong's own words. In the third, alcohol revealed a hidden tenderness that disappeared completely the moment sobriety returned. In the fourth, Rick admitted, in his own words, to a jealousy that directly contradicts the idea that he needs nothing from anyone. Now, in this section, that exact contradiction gets confirmed from a second direction entirely, through his own daughter's description of him, and through the way that description has already begun repeating itself in her own children. A man who does not need anyone would not have felt jealous of a team of heroes for the ease with which they support and trust each other. A man who does not need anyone would not have spent an entire drunken night building an elaborate gift out of gratitude for one small laugh from someone he can no longer remember the next morning. And yet this same man, according to his own daughter, is admired specifically for needing nothing from anyone at all. The gap between what the show has already proven about Rick and what his own family believes about him is not small. It is one of the widest gaps in the entire episode, and Dr. Wong is the only person in the room who seems to notice it clearly enough to name it out loud. This gap did not appear out of nowhere. Beth's belief belief about her father had to come from somewhere, built up slowly over the course of an entire childhood spent watching him operate this exact way, long before this specific episode ever begins. Whatever taught Rick to build his life around never needing anyone in the first place likely happened long before Beth was even old enough to notice the pattern forming. Something shaped him this way at some earlier point in his life, and the show does eventually offer an answer to what that something might have been. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That answer involves a loss the show does not explain right away, one it holds back for years before slowly filling in the details. It centers on a person Rick rarely talks about directly, someone whose absence explains far more about the walls he has built than any single scene involving Beth, Dr. Wong, or the Vindicators ever could on its own. Section 6. Diane, the absence the show treats as a wound. For the first 2 seasons of this show, almost nobody watching had any real idea why Rick was the way he was. Audiences saw the drinking, they saw the refusal to open up, they saw the constant, restless need to invent, to travel, to stay busy rather than sit still. But the show never explained where any of it came from. It simply presented Rick as he already was, fully formed, without giving anyone a reason for it. That silence lasted a long time, long enough that many viewers stopped expecting an answer at all. Then, at the start of the 3rd season, the show finally offered one, and it changed the way almost everything before it could be understood. The reveal comes during an episode where Rick has been captured by a powerful organization and is being questioned about how he invented the technology that lets him travel between different worlds. Under pressure, sitting inside a machine built to read his memories directly, Rick appears to relive a moment from years earlier. In this memory, a younger version of himself is working alone in his garage on an early version of his travel device. His wife walks in carrying their young daughter, and the small family shares a quiet, ordinary moment together, the kind of scene that looks completely different from almost anything else the show has ever depicted involving Rick. There is warmth here, there is closeness. There is a version of Rick who seems, for just a moment, calm and content rather than sharp and guarded. Then, without warning, a bomb drops into the garage. It kills his wife and his daughter instantly, destroying the home and ending that entire life in a single moment. The memory ends there, and the audience is left staring at the aftermath, trying to understand what they just watched. What makes this scene especially strange is what happens immediately after it plays out. Rick, once he is out of the memory reading machine, insists loudly that the entire story was fake, something he made up on the spot specifically to trick the people questioning him. He claims none of it actually happened, that his wife and daughter were never real, that the whole memory was invented purely as a clever trick to escape a dangerous situation. For a long stretch of the show afterward, this denial is left standing. Nobody confirms whether the memory was real or fabricated. Rick refuses to discuss it further, and the show moves on to other stories without settling the question. This uncertainty continues for a long while, through more episodes and more seasons, until a much later episode finally forces the subject back into the open. In that episode, a character named Mr. Nimbus, someone who has known Rick for a long time, casually brings up the name Diane in conversation, clearly expecting Rick to know exactly who that is. Rick reacts with real anger, accusing Nimbus of trying to force a piece of his backstory into existence simply by saying the name out loud. This reaction tells the audience something important. If the earlier memory had truly been invented from nothing, there would be no reason for a specific name to already exist and carry this much weight. The anger in Rick's response gives away far more than his words admit. Eventually, in a later episode built specifically around finally answering this question honestly, the full truth comes out. The memory shown years earlier was mostly real. Rick did have a wife. Her name was Diane. They did have a daughter together, a version of Beth from many years earlier, before the Beth the audience already knows in the present day of the show. And that daughter and that wife really were killed in an explosion, set off deliberately by another version of Rick from a different reality. This last detail requires a short explanation, because it depends on an idea the show relies on constantly: the existence of many different versions of the same person, each living out a slightly different life in a slightly different version of reality. Rick is not the only Rick who exists. There are countless versions of him scattered across countless different worlds, each one shaped by slightly different choices and slightly different luck. One version of Rick, from a different one of these worlds, had already built the technology that lets people travel between these different realities, long before the Rick this show follows had figured it out. That version of Rick wanted to share this discovery with other Ricks across the multiverse, forming a kind of alliance among them. The Rick the show follows refused to join. This refusal apparently angered the other Rick enough that he traveled to this Rick's home, planted an explosive device, and destroyed his entire family as a form of punishment for turning down the offer. In other words, Diane and the earlier version of Beth did not die from an accident or from some outside villain unrelated to Rick's own life. They died because another version of Rick, essentially a twisted reflection of the same person, chose to destroy them out of anger and spite. Once this reveal finally lands, years of Rick's behavior across the entire show start making a different kind of sense. The reason he refused to confirm any of it earlier was not because it was untrue. It was because saying it out loud, admitting that his wife and child had been murdered because of a decision he made, was too painful to say directly, even under pressure, even while trying to survive a dangerous interrogation. He would rather claim the entire memory was fake than sit with the reality of what it actually meant. From this point forward, the show reveals that Rick spent decades of his life doing something almost impossible to fully imagine. He set out to search across the entire multiverse, traveling from one version of reality to another, hunting down different versions of Rick one at a time, trying to find the exact one responsible for the explosion that killed his family. Along the way, he ended up killing many other Ricks who were not guilty of anything, simply because they matched the description closely enough, or because his search grew increasingly desperate and less careful as the years dragged on, without finding the one he was actually looking for. Think about what that means as a way of grieving. A person just told this story might imagine someone drowning their sorrow quietly, withdrawing from the world, maybe struggling to get out of bed some mornings. Rick's grief did not look like that at all. It looked like decades of violence, spread out across an entire universe, aimed at an enemy who kept slipping away from him again and again. Whatever sadness sat underneath that search, it expressed itself entirely through action, through movement, through more invention and more danger. Never through simply sitting still and admitting how much the loss actually hurt. This connects directly back to a pattern already covered earlier in this story. Section 1 showed Rick avoiding a single uncomfortable conversation by building an entire elaborate escape through a sewer and a government building. This new information shows that same pattern playing out on a scale almost too large to picture. An entire section of his life spent chasing an impossible search across infinite versions of reality, rather than ever simply grieving his wife and daughter directly. The scale is different. The shape underneath it is exactly the same. There is one more piece of this story, revealed even later in the show, that makes the loss even harder to fully take in. The Rick responsible for the explosion, eventually given a name of his own by other versions of Rick who also came to fear and hate him, did not stop at destroying one family in one version of reality. As more Ricks across the multiverse began hunting him in revenge, he built an even more terrible weapon, one capable of erasing a person completely, not just from one reality, but from every single version of reality where that person exists at all. He used this weapon specifically on every version of Diane, across every possible world, wiping her out entirely, everywhere, all at once. This detail explains something that had quietly been sitting in the background of the entire show without ever being directly addressed. Throughout the series, whenever Rick and Morty visit other versions of reality, they consistently run into other versions of nearly everyone. Other Jerrys, other Beths, other Summers, other Mortys. Diane never once appears among any of them, in any world, at any point. For a long time, this could have simply seemed like an oversight, or a choice the writers made without deeper meaning behind it. The later reveal makes clear that this absence was deliberate and devastating. There is no other version of Diane left anywhere for Rick to find, meet, or grieve alongside. Unlike almost every other loss in his life, this one cannot be softened by the existence of some other version of the same person living happily somewhere else. She is simply gone, completely, everywhere, forever. The show also reveals that at some point, alone, Rick built a kind of artificial recreation of Diane's voice inside his old, abandoned home, a way of hearing something close to her again, even though the real person is gone. This recreation does not comfort him. Instead, it constantly reminds him of his failure to save her and pushes him to keep chasing revenge rather than let go of the loss. Even the closest thing Rick has to holding on to Diane's memory ends up feeding the same pattern of anger and pursuit rather than offering him any actual peace. Put all of this together, and a much clearer picture starts to form about where Rick's walls actually came from. This is not simply a man who happens to dislike vulnerability as a personality trait. This is a man who once had a full, ordinary family life, a wife, a young daughter, quiet mornings in a garage that had nothing to do with danger or chaos, and then lost every bit of it in a single, violent moment caused directly by another version of himself. Every pattern covered so far in this story, the intelligence used as a shield, the drinking that reveals a hidden need for approval, the jealousy toward people who trust each other easily, the daughter who admires needing nobody as a strength. All of it becomes easier to understand once you know what sits underneath it. A man who lost everything once, through no fault but his own stubbornness, according to the logic of his attacker, might reasonably decide that getting close to anything again is simply too dangerous to risk. This does not excuse the harm Rick causes throughout the show, and the show itself never presents it as an excuse either. Dr. Wong's observations from the earlier sections still hold true, even with this new information added. Knowing why someone built a wall does not make the wall harmless to the people standing on the other side of it, but it does explain, in plain terms, why a man capable of solving almost any problem in the universe has never once solved the one problem sitting closest to him. Some losses are simply too large to invent your way out of, and Rick, more than anyone else in the show, seems to know this better than he will ever admit out loud. There is a very short scene, easy to miss, where a version of Diane appears again for just a moment, inside something the show describes as a place built entirely out of a person's deepest fears. In that place, Rick briefly gets to imagine what it might look like if he had been the one to disappear that day instead of her, sacrificing himself so she could have lived on. He recognizes almost immediately that what he is seeing is not real, that no version of Diane can actually come back, given everything now known about how completely she was erased. He briefly considers staying in that fear anyway, just to see her one more time, before deciding against it and walking away. Even offered an imaginary version of the one thing he has spent decades chasing, some part of him still chooses to turn and leave. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This single, quiet moment says something important about where this story is heading next. A man capable of walking away from an imaginary version of his dead wife, even for just a moment of comfort, is a man still deeply in control of himself in some ways and completely out of control in others. That same contradiction, someone holding everything together on the surface while barely holding on underneath it, becomes impossible to ignore in a much earlier moment in the show, one that happened years before any of this backstory was ever explained, when Rick came closer to ending his own life than at almost any other point across the entire series. Section 7. The bungled suicide attempt and what the show chooses to show. Long before the show ever explained anything about Diane, long before anyone watching had any idea what Rick had actually lost or why he built his life the way he did, there was already a single episode that showed exactly how close to the edge he could get. This episode does not explain anything. It does not offer a clear reason. It simply shows what happens after Rick loses something that mattered to him, and lets the audience sit with the aftermath without much comfort or explanation offered. The episode centers on a character named Unity, someone Rick has a history with, described plainly as an old flame from his past. Unity is unlike almost anyone else in the show. Instead of existing as a single person, Unity is a single mind shared across an enormous number of bodies at once, capable of controlling entire populations on entire planets simultaneously. When Rick and his grandchildren run into a distress signal early early in the episode, it leads them straight to Unity, currently in the middle of taking over another world. What follows is Rick reconnecting with someone he clearly still has strong feelings for, despite how strange the shape of that connection looks from the outside. The two of them spend much of the episode indulging in every excess imaginable together, drinking heavily, taking whatever mood-altering substances they can find, treating an entire planet full of people as the backdrop for their own private reunion. From the outside, especially early on, it looks like Rick getting exactly what he wants, someone who understands him completely, who matches his appetite for chaos, who does not ask him to slow down or explain himself. Underneath that surface, though, something else is happening, and the show makes sure the audience sees it, even while everyone on screen is having fun. Rick's grandchildren, Morty and Summer, are along for this entire adventure, and they slowly begin to notice that whatever Unity used to be before Rick showed up again has started slipping. Unity had apparently worked hard, at some point in the past, to build calmer, more controlled versions of the different societies it oversees. With Rick back in the picture, all of that discipline starts falling apart. The drinking gets heavier, the behavior gets more reckless. What should be a peaceful, well-run planet starts sliding into disorder. Eventually, the two grandchildren decide they have seen enough. They tell Rick directly that Unity might genuinely care about him, but that he is a bad influence, someone whose presence pulls the people around him toward the same chaos he lives in himself. This confrontation does not immediately end anything. Rick stays behind with Unity a while longer, unwilling to simply leave when asked. But the words clearly land somewhere, because shortly afterward, once Rick steps away for just a few minutes, Unity makes the decision to leave entirely. The way this breakup happens deserves attention, because of how much care the show puts into it, despite how brief the moment actually is. Rather than a single spoken conversation, Unity leaves behind written notes, scattered everywhere Rick will find them once he returns, explaining, in its own way, why staying together is impossible. Unity admits, in these notes, that being close to Rick means losing itself entirely, becoming less of what it wants to be, rather than more, and that, in a strange way, Rick achieves the same effect on people that Unity does, just through different means. Where Unity absorbs people directly into itself, Rick pulls people toward his own destructive habits simply by being near them long enough. The two of them, despite being wildly different kinds of beings, turn out to be far too alike in the one specific way that makes lasting closeness between them impossible. Rick returns to find every trace of Unity gone, along with the entire population it had been controlling moments earlier. The planet stands empty and quiet. There is no argument left to have, no chance to convince Unity to change its mind, no one left to even say goodbye to directly. The breakup arrives already finished, delivered entirely through notes left behind by someone no longer there to explain further. What happens next takes place back on Earth, after Rick returns home alone. The tone of the show shifts noticeably here, dropping most of its usual jokes and pacing itself much more slowly than almost any other stretch of the series up to this point. Rick is shown entering his home quiet and withdrawn, a version of him almost nobody watching had seen up until this episode. He is confronted briefly by other members of his family about unrelated matters, and rather than responding with his usual sharp remarks, he simply gives in without a fight, offering no resistance at all, and retreats alone to his workshop. Once alone, Rick is shown assembling a device capable of causing serious harm. Before turning it toward anything else, he first uses it on a small, suffering creature he had been keeping locked away, something that appeared to be in constant pain. The show frames this moment with real tenderness rather than cruelty. Rick is shown speaking gently to the creature, comforting it, before ending its suffering. Then, with the same quiet, exhausted sadness still on his face, he turns the same device toward himself. This is the part of the episode that needs to be handled with real care, and it is worth saying plainly that the show itself handles it with unusual restraint. There is no music swelling for drama. There are no jokes cutting the tension. The scene plays out slowly and quietly, giving the audience space to understand exactly how serious this moment is meant to be taken, rather than turning it into either comedy or spectacle. Rick, alone, prepares to use the device on himself, clearly intending to end his own life in that moment. Before the device can finish what it was built to do, Rick loses consciousness, collapsing before the process can complete. He survives entirely by accident, not because anyone intervened, not because he changed his mind at the last second, but simply because his own exhausted body gave out before the machine could carry out what he had set it to do. The final image the show leaves the audience with is Rick slumped over his own workbench, alone, unconscious, while outside, completely unaware of what almost happened just a few feet away, another family member goes about an entirely unrelated task in the yard. Nobody checks on him, nobody finds him until the next morning. An entire night passes with him lying there, alone, and the episode simply lets that silence stretch out rather than rushing to resolve it. It is worth stepping back here and naming clearly what this scene is and is not. This is a moment of real, serious mental health crisis, shown with more honesty and less comedy than almost anything else in the entire series. It deserves to be treated that way, rather than folded into the show's usual chaos and treated as one more wild adventure. The writers themselves seem to understand this, based on how differently this scene is paced and scored compared to literally everything surrounding it. Whatever jokes exist elsewhere in this episode, this particular sequence is not one of them. At the same time, it is worth being honest about something the show does not spell out directly, but that becomes clear simply from watching the timeline of events. This moment does not happen in isolation. It happens immediately after Rick loses someone he was clearly still attached to, someone who understood the exact kind of chaos he lives inside of, someone who left specifically because staying together was actively making things worse for both of them. The despair shown afterward is not random. It follows directly from a specific personal loss, the same way grief following any real breakup or any real loss might show up in a person's life. This detail connects in an important way to everything already covered earlier in this story. Section 3 showed how alcohol seems to unlock a hidden, more honest version of Rick, one capable of real tenderness and real need, buried underneath his usual guarded exterior. This episode shows something even heavier sitting underneath that same exterior. The version of Rick capable of grieving a real, lost connection this deeply is not a version the show usually lets the audience see. Almost everywhere else in the series, Rick keeps this kind of vulnerability locked away behind jokes, inventions, and constant motion. Here, for one quiet stretch near the end of a single episode, that door swings open, and what sits behind it is far heavier than anything hinted at through jokes about pickles or drunken blackout nights. There is another detail worth including here, because it adds one more layer to how the show frames this entire sequence. Before Unity leaves, during one of the calmer conversations between the two of them, Unity explains that the reason certain kinds of recreational substances had been phased out entirely on the planets it controls is that there is no real need to escape from yourself once your entire world has already become unified into one single mind. In other words, according to Unity, people reach for those kinds of escapes specifically because some part of themselves feels like something worth escaping from. Rick, by contrast, spends the entire episode doing exactly that, escaping from himself through every excess available to him, right up until the one escape he cannot come back from almost happens by accident in his own garage. This raises a difficult but important question about the entire pattern running through this section of the story. If drinking and constant chaos already function as a way of escaping something painful sitting underneath Rick's surface, as shown clearly in earlier sections, then what happened here can be understood as that same pattern reaching its absolute furthest point. When the usual escapes stop being enough, when the loss cuts too deep for even alcohol or motion or invention to cover it, what remains underneath all of it is a person in enough pain to attempt to end his own life, alone, in silence, with nobody else in the house even aware anything was wrong until it was already over. It matters enormously that Rick survived this moment by accident rather than by choice. The show does not give him a moment of clarity where he decides decides life is worth continuing after all. It does not offer a rescue from someone who happens to notice in time. His survival here is simply the result of his own body failing to cooperate with what his mind had already decided to do. This detail keeps the show from turning this scene into anything resembling comfort or resolution. Nothing gets fixed by the end of this episode. Rick wakes up the next day, and life continues exactly as it did before, without any acknowledgement from anyone else in the family that anything happened at all. This is a genuinely heavy piece of the story to include in this kind of analysis, and it deserves to be treated with the same seriousness the show itself gives it, rather than rushed past simply because it is uncomfortable. If anything in this account feels personally close to home, it is worth remembering that real support exists, from people trained specifically to help carry weight like this, and reaching out to them is never a small or unnecessary thing to do. Stepping back out from this one heavy moment, the pattern building across this entire story becomes even clearer once this piece is added to it. A man who built an elaborate escape rather than face one small conversation. A man whose intelligence gets used as a shield rather than a tool. A man whose drinking reveals a tenderness he cannot access sober. A man capable of jealousy despite claiming to need nothing from anyone. A man shaped by an almost unimaginable loss he spent decades avoiding directly. And now, sitting underneath all of it, a man who once came within a single accident of ending his own life entirely, alone, with nobody else in the house even noticing until morning. None of these pieces exist separately from each other. They form a single continuous shape, one behavior explaining the next, each new piece of information making the earlier ones easier to understand rather than replacing them. The show never sits the audience down and explains this shape directly. It simply keeps handing over pieces, episode after episode, season after season, and trusts that anyone paying close enough attention will eventually put them together on their own. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is one thread tying all of it together: pain that never comes out straight, only sideways, through invention. The next part of this story looks at that habit itself, the constant building, as its own kind of answer. Section 8. Creation as substitute for connection. There is one episode, sitting very early in the entire series, that shows exactly what Rick does when the world he lives in becomes too damaged to fix. Instead of staying and dealing with the damage directly, he simply leaves it behind and builds himself a new one. This single choice, made only 6 episodes into the show, ends up explaining almost everything about how Rick handles pain for the rest of the series. The trouble starts small. Morty has a crush on a classmate named Jessica, and he asks Rick to make him a love potion so she will notice him at an upcoming school dance. Rick agrees, mixing something together without much concern for what could go wrong. The potion works exactly as intended on Jessica, but there is a problem nobody accounted for. Jessica happens to be sick with the flu that night, and the love potion latches onto the virus already spreading through her body. Within minutes, this combination turns airborne, spreading rapidly through the entire school, then the entire town, then the entire planet, making everyone who catches it fall into an obsessive, uncontrollable love with Morty. What starts as an awkward high school mistake spirals into a full-blown disaster within a single night. Rick tries to fix it, and each attempt makes things worse instead of better. His first fix turns infected people into insect-like creatures who want to mate with Morty rather than simply love him. His second fix turns everyone into horrifying, misshapen monsters, later given the nickname Cronenbergs, after a filmmaker known for movies about bodies twisting and warping into grotesque shapes. By the end of the night, nearly the entire population of the planet has been transformed into these creatures. The world Rick and his family used to live in simply does not exist anymore in any livable form. At this point, most stories would either force the main character to find a real solution, or force him to live with the consequences of failing to find one. This show does neither. Instead, Rick does something that reveals more about how his mind works than almost anything else in the entire early run of the series. Rather than trying to repair the destroyed world, or staying to face what happened to it, he uses his invention to search across countless other versions of reality until he finds one nearly identical to his own, one where a different different version of himself and a different version of Morty managed to solve this exact same disaster successfully. In that other reality, the alternate Rick and Morty fixed everything, saving their world completely. But shortly after fixing it, through nothing more than random bad luck, an accident kills both of them anyway. Rick's solution is simple and shocking at the same time. He and Morty travel into this other reality, find the freshly dead bodies of their successful alternate selves, bury those bodies quietly in the backyard, and quietly take their place. From that moment forward, they simply continue living as if they had always been that Rick and that Morty, in that version of the family, in that version of the world. Nobody in this new family ever finds out. The switch is completely seamless from the outside. The version of Earth destroyed by the failed love potion, along with every single person who lived there, gets left behind entirely, with no attempt made to ever go back and fix it or take responsibility for it. Morty, unlike Rick, cannot simply move past what just happened. He is shown standing in the backyard of this new home, staring blankly after helping bury the bodies of two people who technically used to be him and his grandfather, clearly shaken by everything he has just taken part in. He knows that somewhere out there, an entire family he grew up with, along with an entire planet full of people, has been left behind to survive in a world filled with monsters, and that he and Rick are the ones who caused it. Rick's response to this horror is remarkably calm. He tells Morty there is nothing to be done about it, and that dwelling on it will not help anyone. He even tells Morty that he should feel grateful things turned out this way, since the alternative would have meant Morty himself ending up as one of the two people they just buried. This single choice sets a pattern that repeats across the entire series in different forms. When something breaks badly enough, when a mistake becomes too large to undo through normal effort, Rick's answer is not to stay and carry the weight of what happened. His answer is to build, invent, or discover his way into a replacement. Then move forward as if the original problem simply stopped existing the moment a new option became available. He even acknowledges, in this same episode, that this kind of escape cannot be used often, warning that jumping between realities to escape consequences like this can only happen a handful of times before it causes serious problems on a larger scale. In other words, even Rick recognizes that this pattern comes at a cost. He does it anyway. This same instinct shows up again in a completely different episode, this time revealed almost as a throwaway line rather than a major plot event. During the earlier described therapy visit involving the mercenary Jaguar, Rick makes an offhand comment while trying to explain, somewhat dismissively, why he does not need the same kind of emotional attachment other people seem to need. He mentions, almost casually, that he once abandoned one of his infinite daughters in a version of Earth that had been taken over by mutants. He says this the same way someone might mention forgetting an umbrella somewhere, with no weight or guilt attached to the statement at all. This detail matters enormously once placed next to the Cronenberg story from earlier in the series. It suggests that leaving behind an entire destroyed world, complete with people he was supposed to care for, is not a one-time event forced on Rick by unusual circumstances. It is something that has apparently happened before, more than once, treated so casually by Rick himself that he can mention it in passing without pausing to reflect on it at all. Building his way out of a disaster, then leaving the wreckage behind entirely, appears to be a repeated habit rather than a single desperate decision made under pressure. Look at how this pattern connects to everything covered in earlier sections of this story. Section 1 showed Rick building an elaborate escape rather than sit through one uncomfortable conversation. Section 6 revealed that Rick spent decades of his life searching across infinite realities, trying to find the specific person responsible for killing his wife and daughter. An entire era of his life spent in motion rather than in grief. Now this section shows that even total catastrophic failure, an entire planet ruined beyond saving, gets handled the exact same way, not through facing what happened, but through inventing a way around it and quietly stepping into somewhere new. There is something worth noticing in how easily Rick manages this kind of transition each time. He does not appear haunted by the abandoned Cronenberg world the way Morty clearly is. He does not appear to carry any visible weight from leaving an entire daughter behind in a world overtaken by mutants. His mind seems built to treat these losses the way it treats a failed experiment, something to walk away from and improve upon next time, rather than something requiring grief or repair. This is not because nothing happened. Real people, real versions of his own family, were left behind to suffer the consequences of his mistakes both times. It is because Rick's instinct, every single time, points toward building something new rather than sitting with what broke. This raises an uncomfortable question worth asking directly. If building a replacement is always available as an option, why would anyone in Rick's position ever choose to stay and fix what actually broke instead? Across the entire series, whenever Rick is faced with a serious enough failure, invention offers him an exit that fixing the original problem never could. Fixing requires facing exactly what went wrong, often slowly, without any guarantee of success. Building something new offers a clean slate instead, a way to simply skip past the mess entirely and continue moving forward as though nothing happened. Given a mind capable of finding that second option almost every single time, it makes sense that facing consequences directly rarely becomes Rick's first instinct. The problem with this pattern, and the show does seem aware that it is a problem even while treating it with a comedic tone in the moment it happens, is that a replacement can never actually undo the original loss. The Cronenberg world does not stop existing just because Rick and Morty leave it behind. The people living there do not stop suffering just because a new, better version of their family exists somewhere else now. Whatever guilt or grief should logically follow an event like that gets skipped over entirely, not because it was resolved, but because a new option became available before anyone had to sit with the discomfort of the old one for very long. This same shortcut shows up in a smaller and less dramatic way throughout nearly every other section already covered in this story. Rather than sit through one therapy conversation, Rick built an entire new body out of dead pests and escaped through a government facility. Rather than admit jealousy directly, Rick built an elaborate, deadly night of puzzles while drunk, hiding the real feeling behind an entire invented structure. Rather than grieve his wife and daughter honestly, Rick spent decades building a search across infinite realities, chasing an answer rather than sitting with a loss. Each of these moments looks different on the surface. Underneath, they all follow the exact same shape. Something hurts, and instead of feeling it directly, Rick builds his way around it instead. There is a reason this pattern deserves its own section, rather than simply being mentioned as a footnote to everything already discussed. Building, inventing, and creating are not neutral activities in Rick's life. They are not simply things he happens to be good at, separate from his emotional patterns. They function as his primary tool for avoiding almost every kind of pain the show has shown him experiencing so far. Where another person might cry, argue, apologize, or ask for help, Rick reaches for a machine, a formula, a portal, or an entirely new version of the world itself. The tool changes depending on the situation. The underlying function stays exactly the same every single time. This becomes especially clear once you notice how rarely Rick's inventions are aimed at repairing relationships directly, compared to how often they are aimed at avoiding, escaping, or replacing them instead. He does not build something to fix his marriage after losing Diane. He builds a search across infinite realities meant to punish the person responsible. He does not build something to repair the Cronenberg world he ruined. He builds a way to walk into a different, already solved version of it instead. Time and again, his genius gets pointed outward, towards solving the practical mechanics of an escape, rather than inward, towards solving whatever emotional problem started the whole situation in the first place. None of this erases how genuinely brilliant these inventions are, or how entertaining they often are to watch play out. The show clearly enjoys showing off just how far Rick's mind can stretch when faced with an impossible problem. But entertainment value and emotional health are not the same measurement. A mind this capable of building its way out of anything rarely gets the chance to practice the much slower, much less flashy skill of simply staying present through something painful. Every time invention offers an escape hatch, that skill goes unused for a little bit longer. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is one relationship, though, that Rick has never managed to invent his way out of completely. no matter how many other worlds he abandons or replaces along the way. Through Cronenberg worlds, through mutant dimensions, through decades spent chasing revenge across infinite realities, one person keeps showing up beside him in almost every single version of events: his grandson. Whatever Rick has managed to walk away from everywhere else in his life, this one connection has proven far harder to simply build his way out of. And the reason why says something important about whether any part of him is actually capable of changing at all. Section 9. Morty as the unfinished treatment plan. Every pattern covered so far in this story points toward the same conclusion. When something threatens to hurt Rick, he runs. He invents his way around it, drinks his way past it, or spends decades chasing a distant goal rather than sit with the plain, simple feeling underneath it. Given everything shown up to this point, someone might reasonably expect Rick to treat every relationship in his life the exact same way, including the one with his own grandson. And in many small moments throughout the show, he does exactly that, mocking Morty, using him carelessly, treating him as a tool for his own adventures more often than as a person worth real care. Except one specific night near the end of the second season shows something different happening, something that does not fit neatly into the pattern already built up across every earlier section of this story. The events leading up to that night begin with an invitation. Rick's oldest and closest friend, a character known throughout the show simply as Bird Person, is getting married, and he sends word for Rick and the rest of the family to attend the wedding. Rick initially wants nothing to do with it, rejecting the invitation outright. Through a small mishap involving the delivery method used to send the invitation, Jerry ends up accidentally transported directly to the wedding location instead of the invitation itself. In order to retrieve Jerry, Rick has no choice but to bring the rest of the family along to the ceremony after all. The wedding itself starts out warm and unusually gentle for this show. Bird Person is marrying a woman named Tammy, and during the reception, Morty pushes Rick to open up more than usual, encouraging him to actually enjoy the event instead of standing on the sidelines mocking everything happening around him. Rick, somewhat reluctantly, takes this advice. He gives a heartfelt, unscripted toast to the newly married couple, letting his guard down in a way the show rarely lets him do. For a brief moment, everything feels stable and happy. Then the entire event collapses. Tammy reveals herself to be a deep undercover agent working for an enormous, powerful government organization called the Galactic Federation, one that has been hunting Rick and Bird Person for a long time because of past actions taken against it. Agents flood the wedding, chaos breaks out, and in the middle of the fighting, Tammy shoots and kills Bird Person directly in front of everyone. Rick, forced to protect his family in the middle of an active attack, manages to get everyone out alive. But Bird Person, one of the very few people Rick seems to genuinely value as a friend, does not survive the night. Once the family escapes, Rick delivers a hard truth to everyone still shaken from what just happened. Because the Galactic Federation is now actively hunting him, returning to Earth is no longer safe. If the family goes home, the Federation will almost certainly track them down and use them to try to reach Rick, regardless of whether they actually know anything useful. The only option left, at least for now, is to find some other planet to live on instead, cut off from the life they used to know. The family settles temporarily on a small, quiet planet, far from everything familiar, and the strain of this sudden, forced exile starts wearing on everyone almost immediately. It is during this stretch of the story that the show finally reveals just how differently each member of the family actually feels about Rick underneath the surface. Jerry, frustrated and afraid, suggests to the rest of the family that the smartest option might be to simply turn Rick into the authorities and return to their normal lives on Earth, arguing that Rick's selfish choices caused this entire disaster in the first place. What happens next matters enormously for understanding where this story is heading. Rather than agreeing with Jerry, the rest of the family pushes back firmly. Summer argues that loving someone is not something you do in exchange for a reward, meaning the family should not abandon Rick simply because staying loyal to him is difficult or costly. Morty backs this up as well, repeating something Bird Person had said to him earlier, essentially insisting that the family intends to stay by Rick's side no matter what, even if Rick himself might not always do the same for them in return. Beth, emotionally emotional and clearly frightened, admits openly that her biggest fear is losing her father all over again, revealing just how much his presence still means to her despite everything complicated about their relationship. Rick is not present in the room for this conversation, at least not visibly. He is hiding beneath the floor of the house they are staying in, listening to every word of it in secret. This detail matters just as much as anything actually said out loud. Rick does not confront his family directly to find out how they feel about him. He hides quietly and listens from somewhere unseen, gathering information about their loyalty. The same cautious, guarded way he gathers information about almost everything else in his life. What he hears changes something in him. After learning that his entire family is genuinely willing to give up their old lives, possibly forever, simply to avoid losing him, Rick appears to recognize, at least for a moment, exactly how selfish and destructive his own behavior has been toward the people willing to sacrifice this much for him. Rather than accepting their loyalty and letting them continue putting themselves at risk on his behalf, he makes a decision. He is going to turn himself in to the Galactic Federation, alone, in exchange for guaranteeing his family's safe return home. How he goes about doing this deserves close attention, because the method he chooses says just as much as the decision itself. Rick does not sit his family down and explain what he is about to do. He does not say a real goodbye to any of them. Instead, he finds Morty, who is playing by himself outside, and tells him a simple, harmless lie, saying that he is heading out to get some ice cream. Morty, sensing something might be wrong, offers to come along, but Rick turns him down and leaves alone. This detail connects directly back to almost everything covered earlier in this story. Even in what is arguably his single most selfless act across the entire series so far, sacrificing his own freedom to protect the people he loves, Rick still cannot manage a direct, honest goodbye. He reaches for a small, invented excuse instead. The same instinct that built a pickle machine to avoid one conversation, the same instinct that built an entire replacement world rather than face the ruins of an old one. Even sacrifice, apparently, has to be delivered sideways, hidden behind a lie small enough to seem harmless. Once alone, Rick contacts the Galactic Federation directly and arranges the exchange himself. He makes sure his family will be released and returned safely to Earth, and he deliberately points suspicion toward Jerry rather than anyone else in the family, since Jerry was the only one who had actually wanted to turn Rick in during the earlier argument. The family is picked up and safely escorted home, now living on an Earth that has been absorbed into the very same Galactic Federation Rick has spent years fighting against. Rick himself is captured, processed, and thrown into a heavily guarded prison, charged, according to his own words, with everything. The season ends with him alone behind bars, having given up his own freedom entirely to protect people he has spent most of the series treating as inconveniences, distractions, or tools for his own adventures. This single choice does not erase or cancel out everything shown in earlier sections of this story. Rick still avoided difficult conversations through elaborate escapes. He still drank his way into disasters he could not remember the next morning. He still spent decades chasing revenge rather than grieving directly. All of that remains true. What this moment adds to the picture is proof that underneath every one of those patterns, something in Rick is still capable of real, costly sacrifice for the people closest to him, even when nothing about his usual behavior would predict it. It helps to place this moment next to the jealousy revealed earlier in this story. During the night, drunk Rick built an entire deadly obstacle course out of resentment toward a group of superheroes. In that earlier moment, jealousy proved that Rick still wanted approval and belonging, even while pretending otherwise. This moment, choosing prison over his family's safety, proves something even heavier. Wanting approval is one thing. Giving up your own freedom indefinitely, without any guarantee of ever getting it back, is something else entirely. One is proof of a hidden need. The other is proof of real, functioning love, expressed the only way Rick seems able to express it, through an extreme, private, almost secretive action, rather than through the plain words most people would use instead. There is a smaller detail from this same stretch of episodes worth including here as well, because it adds one more layer to how deeply this particular relationship differs from almost every other one shown in the series. Before agreeing to turn himself in, Rick is confronted by Morty directly, who tells him plainly that if Rick chooses to leave again, Morty will not forgive him for it. This is not an idle threat delivered lightly, given everything already covered about how much Morty has been through alongside Rick, and how loyal he has remained despite it. A statement like this carries real weight. Rick hears this warning clearly, understands exactly what is at stake in his own grandson's eyes, and chooses to turn himself in anyway, accepting the real possibility that Morty might never forgive him for leaving. Because the alternative, letting his family stay in constant danger because of him, felt even worse. This is not a small detail to overlook. Rick is shown, plainly, weighing his own relationship with Morty, one of the very few connections he has left that still means something to him, against his family's safety, and choosing his family's safety even at the direct risk of losing Morty's trust and forgiveness entirely. Whatever pattern of avoidance and self-protection runs through the rest of his life, it clearly does not extend far enough to stop him from making this specific trade when it actually matters. None of this means the show is arguing that Rick has been secretly healthy all along, or that his sacrifice here somehow fixes or excuses the damage covered across every earlier section of this story. The show does not offer that kind of easy resolution. Rick spends much of the following season, once eventually freed from prison, continuing many of the exact same patterns already established, drinking heavily, avoiding vulnerability, inventing his way around difficult feelings rather than facing them directly. Whatever growth this single sacrifice represents does not appear to stick permanently or transform him into a fundamentally different person going forward. What it does prove, clearly and without room for much argument, is that the version of Rick built entirely out of avoidance and self-protection is not the complete picture. Somewhere underneath everything else already covered in this story, something in him still recognizes what his family actually means to him, and is still capable, at least occasionally, of acting on that recognition, even at enormous personal cost. This does not cancel out the harm caused elsewhere. It simply means the harm and the love appear to exist inside the same person, side by side, without one ever fully replacing the other. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This raises the question that has been sitting quietly underneath this entire story from the very beginning. The one thing all of this analysis has really been building toward answering. Given everything now known, the avoidance, the drinking, the loss, the near tragedy, the jealousy, and now this proof of real sacrifice buried among all of it, is any of this something that could actually change? Or is Rick simply a person who has learned to survive his own pain well enough to keep functioning without ever fully healing from any of it? The people who actually built this character, the writers and creators behind every single episode covered across this entire story, have their own answer to that question, offered plainly in their own words outside of the show itself. Section 10. The prognosis. What the show's own writers say about Rick. Everything covered up to this point has come from inside the show itself, from scenes, episodes, and lines of dialogue that anyone can watch and check for themselves. This final section moves outside the show for a moment to the people who actually built Rick from nothing, the writers, directors, and creators who decided what he would say, how he would act, and what his story would ultimately mean. Their own words about the character turn out to matter enormously because they answer a question the show itself never fully settles on screen. Is Rick someone the audience is supposed to admire, or someone the audience is supposed to worry about? The clearest place to start is the same episode that opened this entire story, the one involving the pickle machine, the government facility, and the final conversation with the family therapist. The writers of that particular episode have spoken directly about why they built the ending the way they did, and their explanation removes almost any doubt about what that final scene was meant to accomplish. According to comments made by the episode's director, the entire final conversation was built around a very specific idea. The team behind the episode felt they needed someone completely ordinary, someone with no special powers or genius-level intelligence, to sit across from Rick and tell him plainly that being smarter than everyone else does not make him someone to look up to. Instead, they wanted that character to tell him he is a tragic figure, someone whose intelligence has not saved him from anything, but has instead been part of what keeps him stuck. The director explained this choice by saying plainly that the scene was never meant to be a celebration of how impressive Rick's mind is. It was built specifically to push back against that idea. This detail confirms something this story has been building toward across every earlier section: the genius, the invention, the constant cleverness that gets Rick out of nearly every dangerous situation he creates for himself. None of it was ever meant by the people who wrote it to be read as pure strength. It was built, on purpose, to eventually be challenged by someone with no special power at all, using nothing but plain observation and honesty. The writers wanted the audience to walk away from that scene understanding that being the smartest person in the room and being a healthy, whole person are two completely separate things. And Rick, according to the very people who created him, clearly falls short on the second one. There is another detail from behind the scenes worth including here, because it reveals just how seriously the actor playing the therapist took this same idea. The actress who voiced Dr. Wong in that episode is a well-known and respected performer, and according to the show's own creators, she delivered that entire lengthy monologue about Rick's family in just a few takes over the phone, treating the material with the same seriousness she would bring to any dramatic role, rather than treating it as a joke buried inside a comedy show. One of the creators has described being genuinely amazed listening to her deliver those lines, describing the moment almost with disbelief that someone with her level of experience was putting that much care into a monologue for an animated character. This small production detail matters because it shows that everyone involved in building that scene, not just the writers but the performers as well, understood exactly how much weight that moment was meant to carry. Beyond this single episode, one of the show's main creators has spoken more broadly about how Rick is supposed to be understood across the entire series, and his comments line up closely with everything already covered in this story. He has said, in his own words, that Rick is wrong about roughly half of everything he does, comparing him directly to a well-known, deeply flawed character from an older television show, someone widely recognized as narrow-minded and often mistaken, despite believing himself to be completely right all the time. This comparison is worth sitting with. It places Rick, in the mind of the person who helped create him, closer to a cautionary example than to a role model, someone whose confidence in his own judgment frequently outpaces how correct that judgment actually is. The same creator has gone even further, addressing directly how he hopes audiences relate to Rick as a person rather than simply as an entertaining character to watch. He has said plainly that if someone finds themselves wishing they could be exactly like Rick all the time, that wish itself is a sign something needs attention. He does not phrase this as a small joke or a passing comment. He states it as something he genuinely wants viewers to understand about the character, going so far as to say he does not want to spoil anything else about the show beyond making that one point clear. In other words, one of the two people most responsible for creating this character has gone on record saying that idolizing Rick completely, without noticing the damage running underneath his cleverness, means missing an important part of what the show is actually trying to say. There is a similar comment from the show's other original creator as well, delivered in a slightly different way, but pointing toward the exact same conclusion. He has said that anyone who would actually want to live the way Rick lives, chaotic, reckless, and constantly running from real connection, would end up completely ruined by that lifestyle in real life, adding that such a person should genuinely be in therapy rather than admired for handling life the way Rick does. Coming from someone who spent years writing this character, giving him his voice, and shaping nearly every decision he makes on screen, a comment like this carries real weight. It confirms, directly and without much room for alternate interpretation, that the chaos surrounding Rick was never meant to be read as something worth aspiring to. Taken together, these comments from the people who built the show answer the questions sitting underneath this entire story more clearly than almost anything shown on screen ever fully does. Rick is not simply a brilliant, misunderstood hero who happens to have a rough exterior. According to his own creators, he is a deeply flawed, frequently wrong, genuinely troubled person whose intelligence and humor make him entertaining to watch, but do not make his way of living something anyone should actually want for themselves. This context changes how every earlier section of this story should be understood as a whole. The pickle machine built to avoid a single conversation was never meant to look purely impressive. It was meant to look, once placed next to Dr. Wong's calm observations, like an enormous, elaborate way of avoiding something small and manageable. The drinking that revealed hidden tenderness during a night nobody, including Rick, could remember afterward was never meant to be read simply as comic relief. It was meant to show a man capable of real feeling, who has built an entire lifestyle around never accessing that feeling while sober. The jealousy admitted during a life or death puzzle, the near tragedy hidden behind a locked garage door, the decades spent chasing revenge instead of grieving directly, none of these moments were built by accident, and none of them were meant to be read as evidence of strength. They were built piece by piece across years of episodes to slowly reveal a portrait of someone in real, ongoing pain, using genius as camouflage for that pain far more often than he uses it to actually address it. And yet, sitting right alongside all of that damage, this story also uncovered a single night where that same man gave up his own freedom entirely, without hesitation, the moment he realized how much his family was willing to sacrifice to keep him around. That moment does not erase anything covered earlier. It exists next to it instead, proof that whatever pain and avoidance runs through Rick's daily life, something underneath all of it is still capable of real love, expressed the only way he seems able to express it, through sudden, extreme, quietly delivered action, rather than through simple, honest words. This is, in the end, the closest thing to an actual diagnosis this entire story can offer, built entirely from what the show itself has shown, backed up by what the very people who created the character have said about him directly. Rick Sanchez is not simply a broken man, and he is not simply a misunderstood genius either. He is someone shaped by a genuine, devastating loss, someone who learned early that invention and cleverness could protect him from ever having to feel that loss directly again, and someone who has spent every day since then building increasingly elaborate ways to keep that protection in place. Underneath all of it, in small, rare moments the show takes real care to highlight, something in him still reaches toward the people he loves, even while everything else about how he lives seems built specifically to keep them at a careful, safe distance. The show never resolves this contradiction, and based on everything its own creators have said, it was never really meant to. Rick does not get a clean ending where all of this pain finally gets addressed and put to rest. He continues on, season after season, repeating many of these same patterns, occasionally breaking through them for a moment before slipping right back into old habits again. This lack of resolution is not a failure of the writing. According to the people who built this character, it is closer to the entire point. Some kinds of pain do not resolve neatly. Some people spend their entire lives circling the same wounds, sometimes moving toward them bravely for a moment, more often building something new and impressive to avoid looking at them directly instead. That is where this story ends. Not with Rick fixed, and not with Rick condemned either, but simply with Rick understood a little more clearly than before. The same way any real diagnosis works, not a solution. Just a clearer picture of exactly what is actually happening underneath the surface, and an honest acknowledgement that clarity alone does not always change what happens next. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.